going live on Facebook now. YouTube, we're live. All right, folks, enough with the music. Cut the music. How you doing? My name is Tim Black. Welcome to the Tim Black at Night Show. I'm glad you could all be here. Periscope, Facebook, YouTube. Everybody, I got a special guest tonight, and I want to first apologize for our lateness. Max is out there saving the world, so he was a little late, and that's okay because we really want to talk to him.
Don't blame Tim.
It's all good. Look, they're in for a surprise. They're in for a real treat tonight. Max Blumenthal is an author and an award-winning journalist. He just recently wrote a book, The Management of Savagery, How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. He's done some great work. He's got the Gray Zone Project, a collective of Ben Norton, Aaron Mate. These guys are phenomenal. They got a podcast. Check it out. Moderate Rebels on iTunes. I subscribe today. You should too. Without further ado, hey, Max, what's up, bro? How you feeling?
Great to be on. Feeling good.
Great to have you, man. I'll just jump right into it, man. You're writing the type of books that get people disappeared. What inspired you to write this incredible, detailed, deep diving piece of work?
Well, it got me disappeared from mainstream media, that's for sure. Got me disappeared almost from my book launch because there was a concerted attempt to actually cancel my talk by some of the very people who appear on the pages of my book promoting regime change in Syria and actually promoting a collaboration between extremist insurgent forces inside Syria and the U.S. and British national security state. And I thought that that was one of the biggest scandals of our time, that the U.S. national security state and also the U.K. national security state, while waging a war on terror, which has caused Islamophobia to rise to extreme peaks and driven figures like Donald Trump to the forefront of our politics, as well as far-right figures across Europe, we're actually arming and training Salafi jihadist groups inside Syria to bring down a government which was, I guess the U.S. decided, for geopolitical reasons, they wanted to take down, and also Israel wanted it taken down. Saudi Arabia wanted it taken down. The Gulf states wanted it taken down. And this was very similar, what took place in Syria, to what the kind of project the U.S. initiated in 1979, where the Carter administration, under the advice of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the national security advisor, father of, Joe Scarborough's co-host, Mika Brzezinski, who decided to launch the largest covert operation in CIA history to arm the Afghan Mujahideen, which saw figures like Osama bin Laden come from Saudi Arabia to the Afghan battlefield to support the anti-Soviet jihad, which the U.S. wanted to wage to bring down the Soviet Union, and popularized, or basically let international jihadism out of the bottle and spread it worldwide. And, so it's my contention with this book, starting in 1979, 2 years after I was born, that if the U.S. had not waged this covert operation in Afghanistan, there would have been no Al-Qaeda. That's just absolutely indisputable. And if there hadn't been Al-Qaeda, there would have been no 9/11 attack, along with many other factors. If there hadn't been a 9/11 attack, there would have been no war in Iraq, no war on terror. If there hadn't been a war in Iraq, I don't think that a figure like Donald Trump would have been able to seize on the kind of anti-Muslim xenophobic politics that became mainstreamed over the years to rise to the forefront of American mainstream politics. And of course, there are many other factors in Donald Trump's rise, but what I tried to do in this book is demonstrate how the U.S., basically the U.S. national security state, this kind of unelected, opaque element that lurks within the Pentagon, within the National Security Council of administration after administration, within the CIA, within all of these institutions that we have no democratic control over, and which actually seeks to obstruct and prevent democratic popular control over foreign policy, how that fueled the rise of international jihadism and in turn created blowback, which has fueled the rise of the far right and has wound us up in the kind of political dystopia that we're in, or helped contribute to the political dystopia. I mean, we can also look at austerity, economics. Right. We can look at, the failure of this kind of corporate two-party system, money in politics. There are so many different, the war on drugs. Mm-hmm. There's so many reasons why we are where we are, but this is kind of a hidden, unacknowledged or under-acknowledged element, and it really tells the story of the politics of my life, which is the politics of permanent war. And so now we're at a point, I mean, we can talk about this later, where young people who were born after 9/11 are now eligible to serve in Afghanistan, and the United States is still there. And those young people, and even people my age, I'm 41, people my age and younger have just lived in this kind of perpetual, at least throughout my adult life, through a perpetual war.
Right.
Wars aren't even authorized by the congressional representatives we elect. And the concept of peace is anachronistic. And so there's only one candidate who really talks about peace, Tulsi Gabbard, and she is the most demonized candidate.
Absolutely.
So my book tries to provide the background for this dystopic situation that we're in.
Well, as you were explaining it, I was envisioning sort of like a Hollywood trope, right? This thing where you go back in time and you change one thing, and it sort of changes it changes the future in so many ways. And you think that one thing to change would be us funding what was considered moderate rebels, or the creation of Al-Qaeda, funding these rebels, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, in order to topple regimes, in order to placate Israel and Saudi Arabia. If we had not done that, then we don't have 9/11, and we don't have all of the military spending. We don't have this sort of perpetual war. That just sounds to me like that would be that one thing. If you go back and you change it, you change history. Is that sort of
a way of approaching? It's just the way the U.S. national security state approaches the world, and so this is part and parcel of a worldview that's totally different from my worldview or yours. Just that you just don't do that kind of thing because of the blowback it will create. And if you have a country or a federation like the Soviet Union, which has the capacity to wipe you off the face of the earth, and you have the capacity to wipe them off the face of the earth, should work towards ending the Cold War. Instead, what the U.S. national security state wanted was to end the Soviet Union by any means necessary. And that meant getting in bed with figures. I mean, they didn't know who bin Laden was at the time, but figures like bin Laden, figures like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was an Afghan warlord who received over $600 million in direct CIA assistance, and who thought very similarly to bin Laden, and who was responsible for some of the worst atrocities. The Afghan war, was a drug dealer who helped fuel the international heroin crisis. And this is someone who the U.S. was happy to directly arm. Bin Laden wound up in Afghanistan thanks to Saudi Arabia, because the U.S. got in bed with Saudi Arabia, got much more closely in bed. It really started like spooning Saudi Arabia because of the Afghan proxy war. Saudi royal family created a matching fund, and they told the CIA that every dollar you spend, we will match, in order to support your quest to end the evil, atheistic, satanic Soviet Union. And bin Laden was basically the point man. He was the son of a very wealthy construction family that was close to the royal family. They had renovated Mecca, and he went to the border in Peshawar in Pakistan and set up a group called the Services Bureau. He funded it along with another figure, Abdullah Azam. And that's where the foreign fighters would come in through Afghanistan. And he created this model with Saudi money, petrodollars, to fund foreign fighters going across the world to fight various jihads that were justified on a religious basis. But from the CIA's perspective, they were like, well, as long as these jihads take place on Soviet borders in countries, against countries that the Soviet Union's propping up, we're all for it, and we don't care if these figures are taking home, special forces tactics and getting, all kinds of light weaponry in their hands.
Right.
And really, what led to the rise of Al Qaeda. So the Services Bureau was the basis for Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda simply means the base, and it was named after the base that Bin Laden and his lieutenants helped set up in Afghanistan.
So Max, so our way to go to war with Russia without going to war was the Soviet Union at the time. Without actually going to war with Soviet Union was to hurt them in the Middle East and use that against them. Was that to like bleed them dry of money, or how did that work?
Well, the Soviet Union was backing up a government in Kabul, the government of Mohammad Najibullah, who was, hated by a large sector of the Afghan population who were mostly rural and very conservative. Many of them didn't like that women were going to school. There was this situation in Kabul where, you had a secular middle class population that was benefiting from his government and a working class population that actually wanted socialism. And then you had the conservative rural population that loathed it. And the US sought to exploit that divide by arming all forces opposed to Najibullah. Brzezinski, who is the national security advisor to Carter, referred to it as the Afghan trap. And basically, what the plan was to force the Soviet Union to intervene directly in Afghanistan and then to bleed the Red Army and to basically trap them. And that's exactly what took place. It was a major mistake for the Soviet Union. The Red Army wound up retreating in 1989, and they wanted to negotiate kind of a transition that would stabilize the country, but the U.S. rejected all negotiations and basically created the conditions for first the War of the Warlords. All the different figures the CIA armed after the Red Army left destroyed Kabul. They completely destroyed the city. And then the Taliban came in to stabilize the situation. And the U.S. Actually supported the Taliban early on because they cracked down on the opium trade, because they were initially providing stability. And Unocal, which was a major oil company that the U.S. needed protection for, wanted to build a pipeline to the Caspian Sea. So you have just all of these cynical interests coming together to provide Osama bin Laden a shot in the arm every step of the way, all the way till September 11th, 2001.
Wow, wow. Wow, as I was reading it, and I admit, man, I have not finished yet because it is just so much information. I was reading.
You're not actually supposed to read books like all the way through unless you're like really into it.
I mean, it's riveting stuff, man. There was one part that really stuck out to me where you described this place in D.C. where these regular middle-aged women would go and they would like basically fund their own terrorists. Really, guys, this was in the book. Could you explain that part, Max?
Yeah, this is in a chapter early on called Adopt a Mouj.
That's it, yeah.
You know, there's a journalist. You should maybe have her on at some point. She's here in D.C. She's a veteran Middle East correspondent named Helena Cobbin. And when she was a young, I think, graduate student, she was invited to a conference in Tucson, Arizona, which she thought was going to focus on Afghanistan and Central Asia. And it was held under the auspices of what seemed like a academic center. It turned out when she got there that it was at a resort. There were wealthy women there, and there were a number of representatives of the Afghan Mujahideen, and they were all sitting next to their individual funder. And she said that basically the way that these wealthy Republican women who wanted to bring down the Soviet Union, they were anti-communists, framed the event was Adopt a Mouj, that everyone got to meet their individual member of the Mujahideen and contribute a certain amount of money to support his efforts to fight the evil communists, and that a hard-charging freshman congressman from Arizona was the keynote speaker of the evening. His name was John McCain.
Wow.
Actually, since publishing this, a few people have actually told me that, yeah, I went to conferences just like this, and they took place around the country at that time. So it really does remind me of how we were encouraged to support the Syrian so-called rebels and not really question who they were through organizations like the White Helmets and to contribute money to that was going into regions that were literally controlled by Al Qaeda's local franchise in Syria. If you donated to the White Helmets, there's no telling where that money went to. They have no monitoring, and the White Helmets, this sort of supposed rescue organization, which was really a global influence operation designed to stimulate support in the US and the UK for direct military intervention in Syria. They only worked with insurgents, extreme Islamist insurgents who were trying to bring down the Syrian government. And those insurgents all worked with the most powerful faction, which was Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda's local franchise, which now controls an entire province in Syria and represents the largest franchise of Al-Qaeda since 9/11. So this whole discussion of the Afghan proxy war in the early and late 80s in my book really provides a backdrop for understanding what the U.S. has done in Libya as well, but particularly in Syria, and how it really tore that country apart while pulling the wool over the eyes of American media consumers who were, told that the White Helmets were just these neutral lifesavers, and they deserve an award at the Oscars for their Netflix documentary, and were nominated for a Nobel Prize. It's just such an outrageous scandal.
Yeah, that's the most insidious part of this, is that the social engineering, the psyops that go on where they influence Americans to believe we're actually doing the right thing. I mean, most folks that I talk to, Max, they actually support our initiatives. They see us as the good guys going in these countries and trying to get rid of the bad guys, and just trying to convince them. And I realize, like, I tell people, don't get so upset with these folks. They're being lied to every day on the media, a corporate media machine that spends millions of dollars to generate these stories and spin these narratives that lead these people to these conclusions. So,
I mean, if wars are going to be marketed to the U.S. public, the people that need to be convinced are, the progressives, the liberals, the people who especially are like the opinion makers and the influencers on social media. And liberal Americans who live in the, on the East or West Coast, who are middle class, they don't want to go to war to eradicate evil like, evangelical end timers do. They don't want to go to war because, America is spreading freedom necessarily. They go for the humanitarian interventionist arguments that we have to save the children from the evil dictator, and that we have a responsibility to protect the civilian population, and that if we just wage this war, one war, we'll have democracy, and it'll be just like our wonderful democracy, which I don't know who benefits from it, but upper middle class people on the coast tend to actually they tend to like it. And so this argument works in various forms, and it generates all sorts of very colorful influence operations. And I write about a series of them in my book. One I write about in the Management of Savagery is the introduction of Nayira. Nayira was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador during the first Gulf War, which was the first major war the U.S. waged after the end of the Cold War. There's no more Soviet Union. We triumphed. We are a unipolar global power. There's no one to get in our way. Let's start doing regime change. Let's start taking out some of these evildoers. Well, how did they convince the American public that this war needed to be waged? Operation Desert Storm. The Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter was brought by a PR firm, a very potent DC PR firm, to testify before Congress. The Kuwaiti ambassador paid something like $50,000 to Tom Lantos's Human Rights Commission. Tom Lantos was the congressman who brought her to testify. And something like 23 PR firms were hired as well to promote this testimony. And 12 PR firms by the Kuwaiti royal family. And she did not reveal her true identity. She simply said that she was just a regular Kuwaiti girl who had witnessed Saddam's soldiers taking babies off their incubators in invaded Kuwait and killing babies. And really no testimony had more influence on the American public's decision to support George H.W. Bush, who repeated this lie in a national address. And we just hear about these lies get spun out again and again. Anytime there is a coup or some kind of regime change effort, there's going to be a humanitarian interventionist lie. And so we have to consider the fact that we, the progressive American public, are the biggest target for these influence operations. And I try to give people a lens for viewing interventionism through with the history that's contained in my book, The Management of Savagery.
And done that, and you do an excellent job at highlighting all these issues and taking us on this journey of what the last 40 years of just information of how America has done its dealings around the world, around the globe, and the impact that that has had on us today. As you just described, like my kids, they don't know a time when we were at peace. I'm a little bit older than you. I'm 48, and I remember, gosh, man. I'm trying to think when we weren't at war. I remember Desert Storm. I remember the Cold War vaguely, hearing about it. But
The 90s was kind of like a time of peace. That's what we were told, that it was peace and prosperity under Bill Clinton. But meanwhile, all of these wars were being prepared, and that is an era that I focus on in my book. I really got obsessed with the 1990s. It's an era that it just isn't looked at, but it laid the basis for the dystopian era we're living in, for a number of reasons. First, the responsibility to protect doctrine that I just described, where liberals are told we have a responsibility to protect this population threatened by the dictator, is invoked to justify a cynical regime change campaign that winds up protecting no one. First with Operation Desert Storm, and then in Yugoslavia to break up a socialist country. Then you had the neocons kind of rise to power in Washington, or start to really get their chops together. And they published a series of documents that laid out their blueprint for the world, but specifically for the Middle East, because as we know, the neocons are, were galvanized by their support for Israel, and specifically Benjamin Netanyahu's Israel. So I write about the Clean Break document, which Netanyahu actually funded. It was funded through Likudnik elements, and figures in Washington like Richard Pearl and Doug Feith, who wound up kind of drumming up the case for the Iraq War, and David Wormser, who is now in John Bolton's shadow national security cabinet, wrote this document for Netanyahu out of a DC-based think tank that advised taking out 7 governments, which were the evildoers in the Middle East that are opposed to Israel and defy the U.S. Syria was one of them, of course, Iraq, and Iran was the real prize. And then you have the Project for a New American Century, which is the big umbrella group of neocons in Washington. And they came up with their blueprint for what they called benevolent hegemony, which is where the U.S. gets to play the benevolent dictator of the world and to take out any country that refuses to abide by its sphere of influence. And this also laid the basis for the Regime Change Target Board. One interesting phrase that is contained in the Project for a New American Century document, it was actually in an essay by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, who are two founding second generation neocons, is that they wouldn't be able to implement this regime change program without some catastrophic and catalyzing event. So that was the exact phrase they used, some catastrophic and catalyzing event. They used that phrase in 1996. So what was that event? I mean, it was 9/11. Yeah. And you could imagine the thrill that ran up Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan's leg on 9/11. It was like, finally, we have the event where we can justify taking out all of these countries. And so Wesley Clark, who was then the Supreme Commander of U.S. forces in Europe, walks into the Pentagon and he meets one of the generals on the Pentagon Joint Chiefs. And the general complains to him. He says that Rumsfeld has just handed us a plan to take out 7 countries in 5 years. This is insane, and it's going to be a disaster for us. And that was, PNAC, that was the Clean Break document, just basically distilled through the Pentagon.
Wow. Amazing stuff. And now we praise these people. I hear
we praise Bill Kristol, woke Bill Kristol. Right?
Yeah. He's on what, MSNBC, or is it CNN all the time? One of
Yeah,
those.
well, there was this crazy segment with Ari Melber, who actually I used to work with at the
That's
Nation,
it. Hmm.
riding in a limo with Bill Crystal and Fat Joe, and they're like bobbing their heads to hip hop, and Ari is back in the studio, and he's like, "That's me and woke Bill Crystal." It's so great to be with Bill Crystal and get him together with Fat Joe. It's like this buddy comedy with a guy who's up to his eyeballs in the blood of Iraqi babies. And, there's no apology there. It's not like he's woke Bill Crystal because he finally got woke on permanent war and like neo-colonialism. He's woke because he's just against Trump,
Yeah.
which is the worst thing of our era is the neocons who did all of these crimes that are described on the pages of my book. They're like supposed to be our friends now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anyone who's against Trump is now a friend. Is now being praised. And John McCain, same deal. What was it? Joe Biden, um, yeah, praising John
Tried to give
McCain.
a medal to George W. Bush at Constitution Hall in Philadelphia just a few months ago for his support for U.S. veterans. It's like how many veterans
Yeah,
don't have legs because of George W. Bush,
right.
and Biden's giving him an award, and this like never gets talked about while Biden's on the campaign trail.
This leads me to one of the questions I wrote down. I wanted to ask you, looking at our Democratic primary candidates and looking at your body of work here, and what you described is really the deep state and just our imperialism around the globe. Like any of these candidates strike you? I think you already answered it, but any of these candidates strike you as potential people that can right the ship, so to speak? Yeah, I'm
Well, let
thinking.
me. I actually wrote a chapter in my book about one candidate, and that candidate is Tulsi Gabbard. And I'll explain, what takes place in that chapter. But one thing that people should know about when you hear Trump talk about the deep state, or you just use the word,
Yeah,
a lot of people on the left, kind of, in the center left at least, the kind of like Democratic Party supporters, they kind of like just because Trump says there's a deep state, they deny it exists.
mm,
But why is it that the CIA has a black budget that the House Appropriations Committee rubber stamps, and they can't see what the CIA is going to spend it on, and the public has no say in what the black budget gets spent on? My book shows what it gets spent on, and it's horrific. But this is something that the public doesn't have any input on, and it's the essence of a deep state, is that there's an actual budget. It's a very big budget, and we don't even know what it's for, and neither does Congress, and Congress votes on it and rubber stamps it. So one of the few members of Congress I know of who ever challenged this concept was Tulsi Gabbard
mm.
when she introduced a bill in 2017, which she's still getting attacked for. I mean, it's
To
shocking.
stop arming.
The
Uh,
Stop Arming Terrorists Act.
that's
Exactly.
it. Hmm.
And so I went to the press conference where she introduced that bill. It was her and like some Republican senator I'd never heard of, Peter Welch or something like that from New Hampshire, and only 13 co-sponsors on a bill that would have restricted the CIA through the black budget from funding groups that would qualify as jihadist organizations that have committed acts of terror worldwide and against Syrian civilians.
I thought that's what our whole purpose is,
Yeah.
to stop that, to stop these people, and we're funding them. And more Congress people, as you just described, wouldn't sign on the bill. That's intention is to stop that, their ability to buy arms.
Right, and it's exactly. And we were told that we were fighting a war on terror. We were told that the war on terror was about our national security, and we were told that by a national security state that really spreads insecurity across the Middle East and has no regard for our own national security, because they opposed Tulsi Gabbard tooth and nail. She was attacked mercilessly for that bill by Josh Rogan, the kind of House neocon at the Washington Post, which is the CIA's favorite paper. She's still demonized to this day. But she brought an interesting guest to Washington for her press conference, someone named Tima Kurdi, who is a Syrian Kurdish woman whose family fled from the city of Kobani after ISIS nearly overran that city. And her nephew drowned, actually, trying to get to Turkey. He was an infant child who was trying to escape ISIS in Syria and drowned on the beach in Turkey. And that child became this global symbol for the plight of refugees. His name was Alan Kurdi. And I'm sure you've seen the picture. I'm sure everyone has watched
The little
this
baby. Yeah.
picture of the little boy washed up on the beach. So Tima Kurdi was living in Canada, and she was already an advocate for refugees. And so she was actually approached by the Syria regime change lobby, and they wanted her to be a spokesperson for the fight against Assad. And she said, no, I'm not going to do that because my family fled ISIS, and the Syrian government is fighting ISIS, and the U.S., through this proxy war where it's flooding my country with arms, has armed ISIS. So I'm against that. So she shows up in Washington with Tulsi Gabbard, the aunt, the articulate English-speaking aunt of this child who was a global symbol of the refugee crisis. And the media did not know what to do with her. They were afraid of hosting her because she was sending the wrong message, which was the true message that Syrians understood. And she said, I'm Kurdish, like Saddam Hussein slaughtered my people. We're discriminated against in Syria, but regime change always brings catastrophe to us and to the people of the Middle East, and that's why I'm here. Stop arming these fanatical groups that are terrorizing us. And, they didn't do it. And Tulsi Gabbard is still campaigning for that, and she's been the target of a disinformation campaign, not only by, neocons and the kind of opaque national security state I write about, but also people on the left. Like even Jacobin published this piece, Tulsi Gabbard is not your friend. And it's like, yeah, there's things to criticize her about, but to say, no, she's not your friend, just completely write her off, means you just don't take the issue of U.S. empire seriously, and you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, one of the things I've been trying to stress, Max, is that because I've heard the criticism of Tulsi Gabbard as far as, she focuses on foreign relations, she focuses on wars, and these things are international. What about her domestic policy? And I tell people, I say, when you focus on eliminating the regime change wars, you're gonna have a lot of money left.
Yeah.
There you go. There goes your domestic policy. See, if we spend the money, if we stop spending money there, what's the excuse? What excuse can they have possibly for not spending money at home? So it's not a direct line, but you get where you understand where she's coming from, and she has a background, a military service. She's currently active. So unlike Pete Buttigieg, my understanding is he didn't actually. He was like in a room in the back of an office in Afghanistan, I think it was. Now, actually in the thick of anything. But he touts his credentials as being military, and they've been putting this out, military, 37, though he's only like 6 months younger than Tulsi Gabbard, and she gets no play. There's no amplification if it's not negative. In fact, the Daily Beast recently put out this article. I know you heard about it. Tulsi Gabbard's campaign is being boasted by Putin apologists.
Yeah.
So now they're doing that thing, and you're absolutely right, man. She is the most smeared candidate. It's like I just did a video about her a couple of days ago on debunking the Daily Beast article, which is really easy to do.
It's not hard.
No, I mean, basically after the first 5 paragraphs, it's about $1,000 from somebody who's in what they call it, a Russian apologist, or a Russian sympathizer, which means nothing. And $1,000 is nothing to a campaign that's raised millions of dollars, as if they met her in the back alley, Max, and gave her a suitcase and said, hey, we want you to be president. I mean, this guy went on the website, made a donation, and he's an American. And so it doesn't make much sense. But
yeah, the person was named Goofy Grapes. That was the name of the donor. And it was the connection to Russia was that this person was allegedly at one point an employee of Redacted Tonight, which is my friend Lee Camp. I'm sure you've had Lee on, or you should have him on, but he's a friend of mine, and he has a comedy show at RT. And so that's kind of the connection to Russia. It's a pretty thin connection from Goofy Grapes to Lee, who really has total independence to do and say whatever he wants, to RT, then to whatever, the GRU and FSB, I don't know what. And then the other donor was Stephen Cohen, who's really the only prominent Russia expert.
That's it, Stephen Cohen, yes.
Professor Stephen Cohen, who was at NYU and Princeton. And, he spent 20 years in the Soviet Union studying the Soviet Union, speaks fluent Russian, has very just an intimate understanding of Russian society, of the history of the Soviet Union. And I think he made a really articulate case, sort of a revision. He wrote a really articulate and compelling revisionist history of U.S.-Soviet relations, making the case that the Soviet Union could have been reformed and that the U.S.'s policy should have been cooperation and reform instead of destroying the Soviet Union and then basically looting the state of its assets and handing it over to oligarchs. And Stephen Cohen advised George H.W. Bush at one point. He was brought into the White House for his insights. He's not someone you can just, in this environment, he is the most demonized academic in America. But nobody has his academic chops on Russia who is as prolific and widely published as him. It just shows like the crudeness of our media, that he can be just wiped away like that. It's just, a Putin apologist, and that taking money from him is somehow toxic in this environment. That just shows what a disgusting political campaign we're about to witness. Just like, I think this is going to be a really awful campaign, if that article is any indication. Bernie Sanders is also, been asked to apologize on Meet the Press by Chuck Todd for protesting the Vietnam War. Like, what world are we living in where the Vietnam War is something that's a source of pride? Mitt Romney protested for the Vietnam War. Then when he was, I think at Yale or something, and then he got a deferment because he went and did a Mormon mission for 2 years. Why isn't he asked to apologize? Because everything's upside down in our mainstream political culture. So then you have Pete Buttigieg, who you mentioned. This guy, no one had heard of him before. I was in Indiana. I actually did a talk in February in Fort Wayne, Indiana, for a peace group. And they were all asking me, what do you think of this guy, Buttigieg? And they'd never heard of him there. And he's a congressman from Indiana. I'm like, people from his own state hadn't heard of him before.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, he's the toast of the media, and he's everybody's hero. And, the only time you hear about Tulsi Gabbard is, she took money from someone who once, was 100 miles away from Vladimir Putin's hotel room.
Or David Duke liked her. He said he liked her in an article or something.
David, that's another, that drives me fucking crazy. When my book Goliath came out, it got reviewed in a lot of places. But it did get reviewed on David Duke's website. I didn't ask them to review it. I've written very negatively about David Duke and white supremacists. I've spent years taking on white supremacists and white nationalism before it was like a thing that everyone was interested in. Yeah. Anyway, so they wrote a review. The review basically concluded that my book, while the criticism of Israel was interesting, the book was not anti-Semitic, and that was a problem with it. And so, because of that, I got attacked in every neocon rag online. Basically, David Duke endorses Max Blumenthal's book. And if you look at anyone who's outspoken against the national security state, who's outspoken against anything neoconservative, they eventually always get attacked for being somehow endorsed or retweeted by David Duke. It makes me wonder, is David Duke really who they say he is?
There you go.
It's almost like he's like this neocon robot who pushes retweet every time they want to demonize someone.
Yeah, and I can imagine that's a possibility. Given everything that you described here, everything that's in the book, would there have been a difference, any noticeable difference, if Hillary Clinton would have won the election, as far as our foreign policy that Donald Trump's been carrying out since he's been in office?
I think there'd still be an Iran deal. I don't think we'd be as concerned about war with Iran. And, anyone watching this would probably struggle to understand why we're facing this escalation with Iran. But it's basically because of the influence of the Likud party, Sheldon Adelson, and these funders of Netanyahu, who are also funders of Donald Trump, as well as the influence of John Bolton, who somehow wormed his way into Trump's National Security Council. I think Hillary Clinton's hostility to Russia would have been pronounced from day one. I think she would have been extremely hostile towards China. So I think the great power competition that was articulated in Trump's 2018 national security doctrine by Jim Mattis, who actually could have served in a Democratic administration. That's what we would have been facing with Hillary Clinton as well. But this extra added tension with Iran, I don't know if we'd be facing that. At the same time, Donald Trump did really push to pull U.S. troops out of Syria, and Hillary Clinton during the campaign was advocating for a no-fly zone over Syria.
Absolutely.
That's code for U.S. military intervention, basically providing air cover for Al Qaeda, and so that would have concerned me, and that would have been absolutely catastrophic if the U.S. had intervened in Syria or tried to even keep the proxy war going. And while we would be hearing nothing, one thing that would be different is we'd be hearing nothing about Russian meddling. I mean, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, there would have been no investigation of Russian hacking of the DNC. They would have been like, oh, forget about it. Let bygones be bygones. No one would care about any of that. But there would be other scandals because a Clinton presidency always brings just so many scandals. And the fact is, I write about it in my book. She was knee deep in corruption, and that was a Trump critique. It was basically a Steve Bannon critique of her that resonated with a lot of people, which was true. It was just simply true.
One of my viewers, he wanted me to ask you this question. Could you do me a favor and ask? His name is Sam. Hey, Sam. Sam says, ask Max why the media such as CNN, Al Jazeera, New York Times, etc., won't admit that the Idlib province in Syria is controlled by Al-Qaeda-linked group HTS as well as other groups as TIP, Ahara al-Sham, but still put words rebels in their headlines?
Yeah, great question. And when you actually acknowledge that, then you have to acknowledge that Donald Trump, the most Islamophobic president in history, who blamed Representative Ilhan Omar for 9/11, is protecting the largest franchise of Al-Qaeda since 9/11. It's based in this province in northwestern Syria called Idlib. And Idlib was taken over by the so-called rebels in 2015 thanks to a massive shipment of U.S. anti-tank weapons and lots of money from donors in Saudi Arabia as well as the Gulf states themselves. The Free Syrian Army, which was funded and armed by the CIA, escorted Al-Qaeda's local affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, into Idlib city. There was footage of them actually celebrating with members of the White Helmets online. And so ever since 2015, Idlib has been under the control of what was Jabhat al-Nusra, which changed its name to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That's why the listener or viewer referred to it as HTS. Then another group that is a smaller faction, which has been funded by Turkey and Qatar, is called Ahrar al-Sham. It doesn't have the jihadist tendency to kind of go international like HTS does, but they are a group that has terrorized Syrian civilians and committed sundry human rights atrocities. And then you actually have as many as 20,000 Chinese Uyghurs who consider themselves actually from Eastern Turkmenistan in the city of Jazir al-Shugur in Idlib, and they through their group have actually rejected all efforts at ceasefires and allied themselves with ISIS. So they're basically an ISIS affiliate, and they're all there. The Syrian and Russian governments would like to retake that province, but Turkey has pushed back really hard, along with, again, the U.S. government and Donald Trump. And the U.S. media, now that there are some battles around the periphery of Idlib, are calling for, save Idlib, this is a humanitarian disaster, we need to protect Idlib, without acknowledging what groups are there. And I would just ask Americans to consider if a large state in the U.S. was controlled by one of these organizations.
We know the answer. We know the answer to that. The only regime change we like is the kind that we orchestrate around the globe. I saw you did some great work in Venezuela. Actual footage in Venezuela, guys. You need to check this out. Where Max goes to a grocery store because the word was that there was no food, and people couldn't buy toothpaste or toothbrushes or whatever. What was that like, Max? And you get around, man.
Well, it's not that hard to go to Venezuela if you can, if you can get a journalist visa or get permission to go in. It's only 4 hours away. If you're a journalist, it's important to go see the situation on the ground that everyone's talking about, and that's what I like to do. And it was very different from the way it was being presented to us, where we were basically being told that it was like Mad Max. It was the law of the, it was the law of the jungle. People were just starving in the streets.
Is
Everybody was desperate. And Maduro was slaughtering people who
Yeah.
were protesting.
Is it possible some areas of Venezuela are well off or normal? I don't know what normal is, but food available, some public services, and maybe some other areas are not in that type of state, because I get conflicting like information about Venezuela, to be honest with you. I got your video, then I got other videos of other people making testimony that's like, this is horrible, they fled, and I'm almost like, I don't know what to believe is really going
A
on.
lot of a lot of people fled because they're facing an economic crisis, where the currency has been devalued to the point where it's virtually worthless, and everybody has to use debit cards. Not everybody, but most people. Bolivares, the local currency, have been devalued. This may be because of bad economic decisions made by the government in 2014. But once the sanctions came in, inflation turned into hyperinflation. There was no way for the government to pay down its debt, to refinance its debt. And now billions and billions of dollars of assets are being seized by the Trump administration, um, and in foreign banks. Last month, sorry, two months ago, 1.3 billion. Now, actually, this was in December. 1.3 billion dollars in gold assets were frozen in the Bank of England for no reason except that the West wanted regime change. Venezuela imports over 70% of its own food, and so it basically uses those assets to pay for food, and then it has food distribution programs which give food to the poor and working Venezuelans, especially in rural communities, and very poor urban barrios, through that money, and now the money is not accessible. So there's no question that people are going to die as a result of sanctions on top of an economic crisis. But the humanitarian crisis, is sort of a contrivance of U.S. media that seeks to blame it all on Maduro. And just my own experience in Caracas and in some of the neighboring states was that I spent time in the poor barrios, and I spent time in the wealthy, more affluent areas where people have lighter skin and they support Juan Guaido in eastern Caracas. And there is food everywhere. The question is, do you have the ability to buy it? And, because of an economic crisis, it makes it harder to buy the food. But the way the US media was selling this was because they were preparing this phony humanitarian intervention where USAID, the State Department's aid arm, was going to ram through a few boxes of aid across the border as a Trojan horse for Juan Guaido. They were saying, well, they're bringing in toothpaste and toothbrushes, which Venezuelans can't get. And what I did was I went to this supermarket in the more upscale eastern part of Caracas and showed that it's just like a U.S. supermarket. I mean, you can get everything you want, like any kind of shampoo scent, conditioner scent. I found like aloe vera infused toilet paper there. Everything was there, if you have the ability to buy it. And then I went to some of the poor areas, and the local government had set up food markets every week so that people could get what they needed for basically free or well below market value. And they were keeping people fed. So food was available, but there's no denying the economic crisis. And right now, there's no way to deny that sanctions aim to make that crisis worse, and that people in Washington are celebrating the fact that Venezuelans are starving, and they hope to use their starvation as a tool against the government they elected to get them to accept a government they simply don't want. And that's just the essence of the sadism of the national security state and the kind of dereliction of mainstream media that just doesn't report on the sanctions. Like, read any New York Times piece about Venezuela right now, and if if it mentions sanctions, it's kind of like a throwaway line in the 15th paragraph, when that should be the story, as well as what we're doing to Iran.
Yeah, just kind of in closing, man. I know Bernie Sanders produced some legislation to make Donald Trump have to get permission from Congress before he touches Iran. I thought that what makes him, why would Trump listen to that, or why would that matter when that's already the rule of the land that is totally ignored by presidents? Like like you need to go through Congress to initiate war, but we never seem to do that. So
Right.
I'm kind of confused as what. Do you know anything about Bernie's legislation?
Well, I think there are a number of people in Congress. Bernie Sanders is definitely one of the leaders there in the Senate. There are even some Republicans in the Senate who want to assert congressional authority on war, and that's really important because Congress abdicated its authority.
Right.
And I describe this in my book by approving the authorization for the use of military force after 9/11, which basically allows the president to authorize military force indefinitely. And so there have been efforts to sunset it, but they can't get a majority to vote. And that's kind of crazy to me. Like, why would you want to serve in Congress and not want to approve vote on issues of war and peace? Lindsey Graham, for example, who's the most militaristic member of Congress, he said, like, I don't care if we vote on it in Congress. I don't care if we vote on a war on Venezuela or Iran, because Lindsey Graham knows that if there is a congressional vote, it's not going to go in favor of the militarists and the hawks and the neocons, because the people
Don't want it. Yeah.
generally don't want to vote for warlike members of Congress.
Absolutely. Maybe the whole idea is to keep it up to the president, and that way Congress, members of Congress can look the other way, or they don't. How can I say, their hands aren't bloody, so to speak, because they have no say in the matter.
It's worth keeping this in mind for the campaign, because what the corporate media likes and what the national security state likes is a puppet on issues of foreign policy and national security. That's why, like Bill Kristol, the most visible neocon in Washington, the first person that he worked for was Dan Quayle, one of the dumbest politicians who ever lived. He was his chief of staff. And then who did Bill Kristol discover and try to cultivate? Sarah Palin, because he likes dumb puppets who he can control. And it's the same on the Democratic side. That's why the media likes Pete Buttigieg, because he said, I'm not so sure Obama should have given clemency to Chelsea Manning. And he says that as a gay candidate. That's so disgusting to me.
That's
He's
what.
saying,
Yeah.
I will be your puppet. Let's make a deal. I want to be president, and I'll do what you want. And Joe Biden, that's how he has made his whole career in Washington for 30 years, is as not just a puppet of the national security state, but someone who's really helped lead their agenda. Tulsi Gabbard and to a certain extent Bernie Sanders are defying the Washington consensus, and it's a real reason why they're either being ignored or mercilessly attacked.
Absolutely, man. I couldn't agree with you more. And just to make things clear, I definitely support Bernie's efforts in order, trying to put a clamp down on the president, taking us to war willy nilly. I was just stating that it just seems like it's counterintuitive, man. That should be how. It should be it shouldn't even be a discussion, is what I'm saying. I mean,
no, it shouldn't be, and it's so sad that we have to start from that point of like, can you please let us vote?
Yeah.
What kind of democracy is that?
Doesn't make sense at all. But I tell you, Max, you make a lot of sense, brother. Tell people where to go to find out more about your work and about the Gray Zone project.
Well, the Gray Zone is my site, and we're doing original reporting every day on the national security state and what it's up to. We've been focusing heavily on Venezuela for the past few weeks for obvious reasons. So go to thegrayzone.com. Follow me on Twitter at Max Blumenthal, and I'll provide updates on my book tour there. And my book is The Management of Savagery. Buy it from Verso Books or a local bookseller like Powell's if you're going to buy it online. Don't support Amazon.
I'm glad you mentioned that, man, because I got all the links. The Management of Savagery, How America's National Security State Fueled the Rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. Verso, London, New York. Moderate Rebels.
Moderate Rebels is my podcast with Ben Norton. You can check it out on SoundCloud. And I think it's moderaterradio.com.
Yeah, if you like my intro music, you'll like his intro music. It's a little jazzy too.
It's
Got some.
actually played by Ben, believe it or
Oh
not.
shit.
Yeah, he's actually a talented jazz musician.
That's what's up, man. Well, look, man. Let me know when you're gonna go to another Lee Camp live taping because you're in DC. You guys are local. I'll meet you there, man. Because we go get beers after the show.
Where are you based?
I'm right here in Clinton, Maryland.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so I'll see you at Laughing Man.
That's what's up, man.
All right.
All right, guys. Once again, this is Tim Black Show. Guest was Max Blumenthal. Add him on Twitter, follow him, buy his book, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
All right. Thank you.
You got it, brother.